Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've posted over 100 excerpts from some of my more than 250 American montage shows that I did in the 1980s and 90s while at UPI Radio. Recently, I embarked on a fresh series of shows. My special guest this time around is Carl DeFebo. He speaks to us from the headquarters of the Pennsylvania Turnpike in the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area. Carl, thanks for taking the time to join us. I'm a great lover of roads. In my childhood, as I got older and more of the interstate system was being completed and we were going back and forth between Indiana and Washington, D.C., we ended up driving on the Pennsylvania Turnpike a lot. I have a lot of memories there, and it's nice to talk to someone who is kind of a mover and shaker in the Turnpike there. Welcome to the broadcast.
I'm happy to talk about the Pennsylvania Turnpike. I do have a passion for the roadway, as you do, but I'm going to have to tell you I need to demote myself because I'm just in charge of the marketing and public relations component of the PA Turnpike.
They told me you were the high mucky muck.
Nope, I'm director of marketing and public relations, and as such, really what I do today is largely media relations, public relations, events, news releases, government relations, and also I assist with the marketing initiatives. We do a lot of safety marketing and marketing for our electronic tolling program and whatnot. But I've been at the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission for 15 years. I actually am educated as a journalist. I did work for a weekly newspaper here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Out of college, when I graduated in the 90s, I worked as a journalist and worked my way up to managing editor when I left the newspaper. And then after that, I worked for 5 years or so as a public relations consultant. So I've been in the business about 25 years nearly. As I said, 15 here at the PA Turnpike Commission.
Well, I think a lot of people have never stopped to think that being, and I hate to use the word flack here because it's kind of a derogatory term for a lot of people, but I've been a flack for various entities. Being a spokesman, particularly for a government agency, is kind of difficult because and I was a flack, a PIO, Public Information Officer, for the Secretary of Agriculture at one time. And I learned very quickly that you have to get the journalists to trust you because people are always skeptical of government. For example, in a worst-case scenario, if there were a horrible accident on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, you would be limited to what you could say, but you'd also want to share as much as what you could say with the journalists, yet a lot of them are skeptical of anything that comes from government. So even though you might have an interesting job, it's not an easy one sometimes.
Absolutely, it's not. And I think what I really try to bring is I bring to bear my experience as a reporter. And I think that I operate best when I see myself as an advocate to the reporter. I'm the person at the Turnpike Commission who advocates on behalf of the reporters. In other words, we want to be a transparent agency. We want to provide as much information as is necessary for the public, to the reporters. And so I think that's how I can best do my job, by advocating on behalf of the reporters. And I think there's a certain insight that you get having been a reporter for however many years, whether it was in print or TV or radio. There's a certain insight that just makes you understand the plight of being a reporter, the pressure of deadlines, the editor who's breathing down your neck, the follow-up questions, and just really the importance of what we do and the importance of government to communicate with media.
If I had a pulpit where I could tell everybody who ever staged a news conference from the White House on down, if I could tell them one thing, it would be, please start the press conference on time. Especially in television, there's nothing more aggravating than turning on the camera and the pulpit's still empty,
Exactly. And, and having worn the shoes of a reporter, we definitely feel that. And I'm with you on that. I mean, I want the events to start on time. I want the speakers to be clear but to be brief. And I want to allow ample time for interviews after the events. And, mostly we want some concise but good, newsworthy information. And I will never schedule an event that doesn't include or entail some type of news announcement. We don't do fluff events. We don't do fluff news releases. We look at this business as the news business, and we're trying to fulfill the need that exists out there in the media, while simultaneously fulfilling our obligation to be clear and communicate with customers.
We've got a lot to talk about, but I think the first thing we should do is for those people who are not from the East Coast, we need to put the Pennsylvania Turnpike into perspective. If you look at the state of Pennsylvania, it's very east-west. It's very left-right.
That's correct.
The largest city on the east side is Harrisburg, which is the state capital, and the largest city on the west side is Pittsburgh. And between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg are the Appalachian Mountains. And I think what happened was that as the highways evolved, by the 1930s, for example, there was one major U.S. highway that connected the two. But because of the mountains, how long did it take to get from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh?
Well, I mean, if you were traveling on Route 30, you're talking about probably a 6 to 7 hour journey through the mountains. And understand, before the concept of the turnpike evolved, Dennis, road builders didn't cut through mountains. There weren't tunnels in mountains. They didn't make cuts. There wasn't dynamite, in the 20s and 30s. And so the way roads were built they were just basically followed the terrain that was given them, by the geography of the region. And so Route 30 was known as the Lincoln Highway, and it had some very treacherous mountaintop peaks that could be icy and snowy in the wintertime, and in the summer and fall you would experience dense fog at the top of the mountains, because you're nearly in the clouds at that point. And so it was somewhat of a treacherous journey along the Lincoln Highway. It was a 2-lane highway, and really the best way to get between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh. And as I said, it was like a 6 to 7 hour journey, but it was really more the conditions that you were experiencing. Sharp curves, you had cross traffic, you had railroad crossings, you went through little villages with stop signs, and so it was a slow going, frequent stops, frequent cross traffic, treacherous for cars of that era.
Well, and I think the thing we forget about is that when we talk about the Lincoln Highway, which was the really first transcontinental U.S. highway, I mean, planning for this generated so much excitement. Every little town across the country wanted the Lincoln Highway to go through their town and not the one 20 miles to the north or south of it. But even though it was a pioneer road, it was far from perfect, and there were some really steep grades in Pennsylvania that the Lincoln Highway went up and down that made it impassable for really heavy trucks.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think of a couple things, Dennis. Think of the road building technology that was out there. We didn't have all the highfalutin, high-tech gadgetry and explosives and techniques that we had today. I mean, back in the day, roadways were really constructed to make them easy to be built. They were designed for constructability, I guess is what you could say. They were designed to make it easier on the contractor to get the job done, to make it easier to do the paving, to make it easier to do the construction. And nobody really built or designed roadways from the motorist's point of view. And if you really have to look at the gist of what was unique about the Pennsylvania Turnpike, was that indeed there were great lengths taken to create something that was for the driver's comfort and convenience.
I don't want to jump ahead here, but we need to go back a step before we talk about building the turnpike, and that is, if I'm not wrong, there was an attempt to build a railroad between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg, and by its very nature, a railroad can't go up and down hills, really. It has to have a fairly stable grade. That railroad was never finished, was it?
Yeah, it was a really interesting epoch, I guess, in the history of railroading. In the late 1800s, it was commonplace, during the railroad boom, it was really commonplace for competing lines to come in and invade one another's territory and try to steal business away from your competitor. And such was the case with the railroad you're referring to, Dennis. It was called the South Penn Railroad. It was designed to compete with the Pennsylvania Railroad, which really ran east to west through the center portion of Pennsylvania, an hour or so north of Harrisburg. The railroad was kind of known as Vanderbilt's Folly because Vanderbilt, who was the president of a rail line in New York, New York and Hudson River, he saw the Pennsylvania Railroad and wanted to hone in on some of that territory, and so he envisioned the South Penn Railroad as an option that would compete with the PENNSY that was to its north. And so construction of the South Penn was started. They envisioned connecting Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, and basically the way that was going to work was they were going to dig 9 tunnels, and complete the rail bed. And it was basically going to travel from Harrisburg to, across Pennsylvania to the west and link the steel city of Pittsburgh with the capital city of Harrisburg.
If I'm not mistaken, one of the breakthroughs was they realized they could go down a river valley. Was it the Juanita?
Yep, the Juniata.
Juniata. I've always pronounced it Juanita.
Yep, it is a pronounced J. You do enunciate the J, and so it's the Juniata River Valley was one of the valleys, right out there in the mountainous regions of Pennsylvania. For a certain stretch in that valley, the South Penn Railroad was to follow the path of along the shores of the Juniata River, but it still had to deal with the Allegheny Mountains, and that was the real problem for that trip between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, was crossing those mountains. How do you get over the mountains? Well, the railroad was really the first to propose actually going through the mountains. And the railroad started construction. Workers, thousands of workers dumped into the rural areas of Pennsylvania. In 1884, contracts were awarded for a bridge over the Susquehanna River near Harrisburg, and 7 of 9 tunnels on the South Penn Railroad. The construction continued for about 2 years or so. And what was interesting, what happened next was there was a truce that was struck between the two competing parties, and construction just basically was halted on the South Penn Railroad. Halted, Dennis, so fast that workers just basically dropped their tools and walked off the job.
So how much of the right-of-way and the tunneling between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh was finished when the project was abandoned?
I want to say that they had about 60% of the grading that was finished, the roadbed grading. They had completed 5 miles of tunnels, and basically they were probably more than 3/4 of the way through with the construction, the excavation portion of the project. However, not 1 foot of track had yet been laid. So they started timbering some of the tunnels. They bored through several of the tunnels, but they weren't probably even close to being 50% done with the tunnels. But overall, I want to say they were about halfway through or so with the construction of the South Penn Railroad when this truce was struck, and basically the project was completely abandoned.
So from the late 1880s until work would begin on the turnpike, which we have to explain here, that rail bed just sat there and the tunnels started caving in and filling themselves with water.
Pretty much that's what occurred. Now, with the understanding that there was a little bit of a financial wrangling to sort out all the legal and financial issues. It took about a decade. A lot of it, most of it, was reverted to nature and was forgotten. A couple pieces of it of the South Penn were sold off, and they were operated by small railroad lines for a time being.
I think that was near Ligonier, Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken.
There were several of them. There was one in Somerset, one in Ligonier. But keep in mind, too, that the 1880s, that was towards the end of the railroad boom and the beginning of the automobile era. I mean, remember that Oldsmobile came about in the 1890s, and really I guess the end of the railroad era was in sight.
People are saying, what's the deal? The turnpike, the railroad? Well, to cut to the chase, they essentially built the turnpike where the railroad was going to go. Let's jump back again and ask this question. When was it that somebody said, hey, we've got the Lincoln Highway, but it's treacherous and steep and icy and foggy. we've got a more level path between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh. It was laid out for a railroad. Why don't we see if we can go there? Because that's going to be pretty level. When did that seed begin to germinate?
Well, the seed really, Dennis, was the Great Depression. You know, in 1932, FDR was elected president on his economic recovery program that he termed the New Deal. And that really, interestingly, is what kind of formed the seed that would eventually spark the idea to build the turnpike. The idea for the turnpike came about when a state employee of the planning board basically looked at those abandoned bridge piers in the Susquehanna River. This was a planning board employee that tracked trends in transportation, and the planning board would recommend new projects for these New Deal projects, for jobs creation. And so this employee and a couple other folks, somebody from the Motor Truck Association, and there was also a state representative, they basically came up with the idea to build a new toll bridge over the Susquehanna River near Harrisburg using the abandoned piers from the old South Penn Railroad. As talks progressed, I guess probably in the 1934 timeframe, they decided that taking it a step further, you could even use the abandoned railroad right-of-way and the abandoned tunnels to create an entire toll highway that would join as I said, the steel city of Pittsburgh with the state capital of Harrisburg. And so the idea took root in 1934 as a result of the Depression, as a result of the New Deal program, and as a result of the need for our country to get back to work. So I just think it's kind of intriguing, the geopolitical factors that were at work, that the conditions were perfect for a project like this to take root. And it's really intriguing to me, the world events, if you will, that had to come together in order to start the first superhighway in America.
Well, I'm looking at some information here that your office provided, and there's a fellow here who looks as if he's the patron saint of the turnpike, Representative Clifford Patterson. Tell us about him. He seems as if he's a pretty colorful figure.
Well, it's interesting because Representative Patterson was an individual who was from just outside the Pittsburgh area, and he became very well acquainted with the journey from Pittsburgh to Harrisburg, to come to the state capitol for legislative sessions. He had to take U.S. Route 30, the Lincoln Highway, in order to go from his home district to the capitol for the sessions, and he became quite familiar with that journey. And so I think he was very highly motivated and had personal reasons why he thought it would be a great idea to create this, what they called this all-weather highway, that no matter what was happening on top of the mountains would take traffic through the mountains in a way that they could avoid the snow and ice and the fog that was created on the Lincoln Highway. Certainly it was much more than selfish reasons. I mean, this is a state representative after all. He had the good of the people in mind. He wanted to help put people back to work. And he also saw the value to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania of connecting two major, our major industrial city to the west to our capital city. And then don't forget, beyond Harrisburg to the east lie Philadelphia, the major port city for Pennsylvania. And so he really was the person who drove the creation of the turnpike. And he actually, the way that he did that was that he introduced a measure to create a feasibility study to look at that abandoned South Penn Railroad right-of-way and to determine if it would be even feasible or possible to convert that into some type of a four-lane cross-state highway system. So he indeed is the patron saint.
And the thing about it that is also really amazing, even though there was so much manpower available in the Depression, the Turnpike Commission, from what I read here, was formalized in 1937, and the road opened in 1940. I mean, that's an enormous project in 3 years.
I know, it's really unbelievable, because even if in 1937, actually what happened was that the feasibility study determined, hey, yeah, it is possible. You could actually develop a 4-lane highway through the mountains using some of the right-of-way from that railroad and using some of those tunnels. And so what happened in 1937 is that they created a bill that would authorize the creation of a Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission. That was just a body. It was a collection of 4 individuals plus the Secretary of Transportation that would be kind of at the helm of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So construction of the actual roadway didn't even really begin until 1938, Dennis, believe it or not. So it was completed in less than 2 years, because in 1937 they just established the Turnpike Commission, which needed to go about the job of, coming up with a plan, coming up with the design, and coming up with the funding.
The Turnpike, I think, pretty well standardized how sharp a curve can be, how wide the road has to be. I mean, it became a very safe roadway because it was predictable.
That was one of the big focuses for the engineers, who were really innovating the whole concept of this end-to-end uniform design criteria. And the value in that really was, you, as a motorist, you knew what to expect. You knew that the hills were only going to be so steep, that the curves were only going to be so sharp, that there was not going to be stop signs, there was not going to be cross traffic, there were not going to be railroad crossings. And so there was this expectation of uniformity, that nothing was going to stand in your way, and that was basically, it was pedal to the metal for 160 miles. And as you mentioned, the Autobahn, nothing had really been seen like that in the U.S., other than, there were stories of the Autobahn appearing on newsreels in the 30s and in newspapers, but really there was nothing like that in the U.S. As you mentioned, Dennis, roadways not only varied from state to state, but they could vary from township to township, or municipality or county to county, based upon, the time that they were built. They could even really vary in materials. And the Pennsylvania Turnpike really was the first time, the first interstate, or the first highway. The interstates weren't even dreamed of until 16 years later. But it was really the first roadway in the U.S. that had this consistent end-to-end driving experience.
How much of future road building in the U.S. really owes its birth to what those engineers were doing on the Turnpike?
The short answer to that, Dennis, is any interstate that you drive on really owes its existence to the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And as a matter of fact, the Turnpike is often characterized as the granddaddy of the interstate system, or the granddaddy of the highway system, because nothing like that had been seen. We talked a little bit about construction and highway building in the first segment a little bit, and roadways. Engineers designed roadways so that they would be easy to build, so that the contractors could basically slap down some pavement, slap down some blacktop or concrete, and just basically follow the contours of the land. It was an extreme challenge to be able to make tunnels and to make these are common today on interstates, what we call cuts and fills. If you really think about a highway system, it's made up of cuts and fills. When you're driving on the highway the next time, at least here in the Northeast, especially in the mountainous areas or in hilly regions, you're either basically driving on a fill, which means a lot of material had been brought in to fill a valley or to fill, not a canyon, but a general downslope, or it was a cut, meaning that steam equipment at the time, had basically removed the hilltop and created a man-made canyon or ravine that you see on your left and right as you're passing through, along the highway. And so that's really what the Pennsylvania Turnpike was. It was taming that mountainous terrain. It was trying to provide a highway that took in the comfort of the motorists and the travelers, rather than being something that was just easy for us to build.
Well, one of the things, too, that amazes me, not being an engineer, is I remember seeing a demonstration one time where they had this very large sandbox, and they had built a representation of hills and valleys, and the person giving the demonstration took a yardstick. And he said, okay, this yardstick is going to be where the highway goes. And he pushed it down through the tops of the hills and said, okay, we will V this out. We'll build a gorge through here. And then the the yardstick is up in the middle of nowhere. And he says, okay, now we've got to fill in underneath this. And it was a very graphic demonstration of keeping the grade level. And as you say, cut and fill. It's constantly cut, fill, cut, fill, cut, fill as you go through the mountains. Now, luckily, when you carve out of a mountain, you then can use that for the fill. But a lot of times you have to truck in a lot of fill also.
Right, and that's why planners, because of all the effort that's involved in the construction of these cuts and fills, that's why planners felt that using that South Penn Railroad right-of-way gave them a great advantage and, if you will, a great head start, because some of that work had already taken place. Now, obviously, the railroad was going to be one track width. That's not even really wide enough to accommodate one lane of traffic. And on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, when it opened, it needed 4 lanes plus a 10-foot median. And so, the original planners and constructors had to really widen out what was started by the South Penn Railroad. And also, it's important to remember that the planners didn't follow the 100% of the right-of-way of the South Penn. And sometimes they went off that alignment and decided to take a little bit of a different route, but it did indeed provide a head start, if you will, on taming that terrain.
I'm sure that there have been turnpike enthusiasts who've gone out and tried to figure out where that old right-of-way was that was never used. That would be kind of urban archaeology, if you will.
There are actually several folks that we would consider to be history buffs that have dedicated their lives to really researching the right-of-way of the South Penn. I know one gentleman from Pittsburgh who was a railroad buff who was infatuated with going to libraries to find contour maps, knocking on doors at farmhouses and asking property owners about have they ever seen the South Penn rail bed. He takes a lot of photographs, he collects maps, he scans these maps and posts them electronically, but there are a number of history buffs, if you will, that are not only fond of the South Penn Railroad, but by the same token have become infatuated with studying the Pennsylvania Turnpike system because of its important role in the history of transportation in our country.
The other thing, too, is it's one thing to widen a grade to accommodate a 4-lane highway. Were these 12-foot lanes, do you know, back then? Because that would have been about a 60-foot right-of-way before you got to the shoulders. So you would go from one railroad width to 60 feet plus. I can see that took a lot of work and a lot of filling sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And as a matter of fact, Jen, if you would include 4 12-foot lanes, the turnpike actually had a uniform median width, which was 10 foot through the center median, and then it had the shoulders as well. And I want to say that the shoulders really ranged. I guess they were anywhere from 5 to 10 feet, and I guess they kind of varied. But anyway, so you had 12-foot lanes, 4 12-foot lanes, and a 10-foot shoulder, basically, that made up the turnpike system, the original system, along with its 10-foot median. So yes, the tunnels had to be substantially widened out. The roadbed grade had to be substantially widened out as well. And so it took a lot of workers to accomplish all that. And what's amazing to consider is that you were looking at you're still kind of in the steam-powered era. A lot of the equipment was steam-powered, and a lot of the techniques would be considered very basic compared to the techniques that are used, the construction techniques that are used today. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we talk about is road building technology in 1938 and 1939 basically entailed stripping off the topsoil of an area, compacting the earth, and then setting up formwork to pour concrete on top of the compacted earth. Today, when we build a road or when we replace a section of the turnpike, we're talking about kind of a layer cake that with different types of aggregate and different layers that would amount to up to a yard in thick in some areas. And the technology has just come so far, and we really understand the impact of drainage and groundwater on these highways, and so we do it much differently today. But only 75 years ago, a reinforced concrete was basically laid right down on the compacted earth with little, if any, subbase.
And early on, Carl, the turnpike was very different because of all the tunnels.
The tunnels are one feature of the Pennsylvania Turnpike that really attracted a lot of attention during the planning and construction phases. A lot of people refer to the turnpike as the tunnel highway because it was so unique for a highway, a four-lane highway, to bore through the mountains like that. And given the number of original tunnels, there were 7 originally. Today we have just 4 that remained. 3 of them were bypassed. Given the number of tunnels, it made it a really unique and singular experience for the motorists who drove on the turnpike in the heyday. And people that call us and reminisce about the turnpike always remembered as young people driving through those tunnels and experiencing this singular high-speed, unique experience that you couldn't get anywhere else in the country until the mid-1950s.
Well, as a kid, and then later as a young adult driving, my favorite tunnel was the Sidling Hill Mountain Tunnel, which was bypassed along with Rays Hill.
That's right.
It's in the Breezewood area. You were talking about the Lincoln Highway going up into the fog. One of the negative things that happened is when they built the bypass, it actually went up a little higher, and it crosses over almost the portal of the Sidling Hill. It was just enough higher that I understand they got bad weather in that section of turnpike that they didn't used to when the turnpike went through the mountains.
Yeah, absolutely right. As a matter of fact, Dennis, the whole tunnel issue was an interesting component of the original turnpike because of the fact that when the turnpike first opened in 1940, basically the tunnels became a choke point. The tunnels were 2-lane tunnels.
We need to explain here is the fact that it was a 4-lane turnpike, but at every one of those tunnels, it went down to 2 lanes. And in the holiday season, you could wait for hours trying to get through.
That's right. So traffic had to bottleneck down to from 2 lanes eastbound to 1 lane, and you got these long lines of traffic waiting to get inside these tunnels, which was basically, it was one tube at the time. It was a bidirectional tunnel. So you were right there up against the oncoming traffic. They shared the same tunnel. And back in the mid '60s, well, very early on, when in the young history of the turnpike, even probably by the first or second year of operation, planners realized that these tunnels have become a choke point. They were a choke point in the first week of the turnpike's operation, with long lines of traffic waiting to get in and out of the into the tunnels. They realized they'd have to do something about that, and the something was adding a second tube. Much like they did in the initial construction of the turnpike, they conducted a feasibility study and said, look, it's possible and reasonably priced to add a second tube for eastbound traffic or for westbound traffic to these tunnels on all but 3 of them. And 3 of them could be completely bypassed because now, 28 years later in the late 1960s, now we had the technology to really blast through the mountains. So you are right. Above the Sidling Hill Tunnel and above the Rays Hill Tunnel, the turnpike does elevate above the original site of the tunnels, which actually, by the way, do still exist, Dennis. However, if you notice that, if you ever have the opportunity to drive on the turnpike, there is a huge cut at the top of those mountains, so you don't peak out, if you will. You're still driving through a cut, so it's kind of a compromise, if you will.
Now, the other thing, too, is I'm going to mention the name of a company that you have to be a certain age to remember, and that's Howard Johnson's. You still see their motor lodges out there, but at one time, Howard Johnson was the gold standard for restaurants on the East Coast. The Turnpike let the contract for the restaurants in the plaza areas to Howard Johnson, and I was told that it became fashionable on weekends for people in Pittsburgh and Harrisburg to actually drive out on the Turnpike to go to the Howard Johnsons and eat fried clams. That it was kind of a ceremony people were doing.
Yeah, it really was a tradition. I mean, a Sunday drive on the Turnpike became, in fashion, if you will. A lot of families did this. I mean, today, we would never, ever think of loading the family up into the minivan and going for a joyride. People just don't think like that anymore. But it really was a very common practice for folks from all over. Even not just from Pittsburgh and Harrisburg, but people in the mountainous areas and some of the small towns that dot the turnpike, like Somerset and Bedford and Breezewood, people would just hop on the turnpike for the opportunity to head to one of the service plazas and to one of the Howard Johnson's lunch counters, as they called them. And in addition to just the lunch counters, a couple of our plazas, the Midway plazas near Bedford, we had a westbound and a eastbound Midway plaza. Those were full-blown restaurants with sit-down service and waitresses, and so the Midway plazas really became the attraction. Those were the plazas right in between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, and those were the ones that seemed to get a lot of the Hojo's business. And like you said, people came for the fried clams or the grilled wieners, and they had great ice cream and soda fountains, and and people made a day of that experience.
One of my favorite memories was being at one of those Howard Johnsons in the 60s with my parents and my young sister. And my mother stops eating all of a sudden. She says, "I recognize that laugh." It was her sister, whom she hadn't seen in a year, who with my Uncle Wendell were driving back to Cincinnati from Philadelphia. They had let my cousin Pauline off at Drexel or some school over there. And here in the middle of this Howard Johnson, these two women, my mom was 4'10", my Aunt Pauline was about 4'11" maybe, are rushing toward each other, screaming and yelling. And it was as if it happened yesterday. I mean, I never will forget that moment. The other was one night on the turnpike. I was sitting at a lunch counter, and this very wealthy-looking woman in a very, very expensive-looking mink coat or some kind of chihuahua or something, I don't know, was trying to eat a hot dog, and the mustard starts running down her arm. And I've never seen a look of panic on an older woman wearing an expensive outfit as I did that night. And I remember driving through that cut there at Everett, and water had come down the sides and frozen. It was wintertime, and it was like a million mirrors as you went through there. I mean, I think everybody who's ever driven that road has some pretty magic moments. Maybe not as exciting as mine, but there are memories on the turnpike, and my golly, you've had 75 years to make them.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, people that are Turnpike fans, they take it real personal. They had everybody. That's the uniform thread that goes through all of us. We all have some memory that from the Pennsylvania Turnpike that really brings us back to our youth. And I've heard many stories about those different memories that folks have had on the Pennsylvania Turnpike over the last 75 years. And that's actually one thing that we're hoping to do is begin to collect some of those memories starting this fall with an online commemoration, if you will, that we're going to be having during our 75th year. And certainly one of the stories that I'd like to share with you, Dennis, is that I was contacted several years ago by a woman who is a Irish folk singer. She actually immigrated to Ireland in her teens or early 20s, but had memories of driving from Philadelphia to her grandmother's house somewhere in Ohio and taking the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And she reached out to me because she wanted to write a folk song that kind of recounted her memories of driving in the back of the station wagon as a young girl and waiting to go into those tunnels, which were so dark and mysterious at the time. And she remembered hearing that sound of the station wagon's tires on the seam on the concrete seams and joints as her dad drove the car through the tunnels. And she remembered that dut 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 that you get in the car. She actually called me because she was writing the song and she wanted to know how far apart those concrete slabs were so that she could precisely reproduce that rhythm that she wanted to have in her folk song, which was about the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And, if something interesting, if you go to the internet or go to YouTube and enter the Pennsylvania Turnpike song, you'd probably come up with 4 or 5 different songs that have been written over the years about the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So you're definitely not alone, my friend, in your love of the Turnpike, and I think we all hold that very dearly and very personally because we've had these great experiences along the roadway. it's an exciting moment. Usually back in the day when people were taking the Pennsylvania Turnpike, they were making a long trip or a special journey, and so you're kind of wound up and excited to be traveling to begin with, and I think that really only heightens the experience of excitement when you bump into your aunt on the Turnpike at a rest stop, for instance.
I remember the first time we went on the Turnpike, we pulled on at the New Stanton interchange. And back then you got a ticket. It was like an IBM punch card. And my dad handed it to me and said, "Denny, don't let this go out the window." And I remember putting it in the glove compartment, and I'd keep checking to see if it was there, because you had to hand it to the attendant when you exited the Turnpike so they'd know how far you'd gone.
Absolutely.
Because you paid a certain toll. Very quickly, Carl, I'm sure with your research you found out the answer to this. What was it like for those people who were the first ones to drive the Turnpike, to drive a road unlike any other highway that had ever been built in this country?
The 1930s is kind of the era of the engineering marvel in America. We were in the process of building these great dams and national parks and the Golden Gate Bridge, and so that was a time of like new industrial discoveries and these massive public works projects that were really brought on by the New Deal and the effort to get the country out of depression and back to work. And so you're setting a stage here for a time in America when this was big news. I mean, there was nothing like this ever before seen, and the newsreels and the newspapers, and it wasn't just the Pennsylvania media that was covering the story of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. It was national news. It was reported on the newsreels. There are black and white newsreels that were shown in movie theaters all over the country about the construction of the Pennsylvania Turnpike and America's first superhighway, and kind of the engineering challenge of cutting through the mountains to connect these two important cities in the Northeast. And so there really was a lot of interest in America during that time about the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And I think people got that it was going to herald in a new era of transportation in the United States. I think people easily and readily understood that it meant something significant to our country, and that it was going to be the first of the superhighways in America. And eventually, 16 years later, when President Eisenhower, signed the bill to create the U.S. interstate system, the Turnpike was really the forerunner and the grandfather of that. That the Turnpike was the inspiration. A lot of those design criteria that we talked about, the consistent design criteria, that concept was employed on the interstate system, and really was the forerunner of our interstate system. So it does have a very special place in the history of the United States. I mean, think about how far we've come just in the past 75 years with transportation and the ease of travel today. Back in 75 years ago, you really wouldn't think much about driving to Colorado, but now you can do that, from the East Coast. But now it happens millions of times a day, these longer journeys, and it was enabled by the interstate system, which was inspired by the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So it is significant, and one of the phenomena that occurred when the Turnpike opened on October 1st, 1940, news spread quickly about that opening. And, people started to line up at the interchanges for the chance to be the first to get a toll ticket and drive on this much heralded highway. We take it for granted today. Today we've got probably 195 million travelers a year on the Pennsylvania Turnpike system, compared to just over 2 million in our first year. I think we whizzed by without really giving this a second thought. So it is refreshing and important to remember what the history and the roots of the Pennsylvania Turnpike are, and how significant it was to our country, and how significant it was to our mobility and our economy.
And if I may speak for you, in those past 75 years, the Turnpike has been expanded east and west to connect with the New Jersey Turnpike and the Ohio Turnpike. There's a leg that goes up to Allentown, which itself has two beautiful tunnels in it. There's a new turnpike right-of-way that goes from Pittsburgh down to West Virginia through one of my favorite towns, Brownsville, Pennsylvania. And you've three-laned it each direction in several places, eliminated three tunnels, double tunnel the ones that were left. It's the old road, but it's not the same old road anymore.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's interesting. So the original Turnpike was 140 miles. Today, the Turnpike Commission operates 552 miles of tolled highway across the Commonwealth. We have our east-west main line that links Ohio and New Jersey. That, we basically grew from that 160 miles to our system today. We crossed the entire Commonwealth from east to west, and the northeastern extension goes north from just above Philadelphia to Scranton, close to the New York border. As you said, we have made a lot of improvements. As a matter of fact, our system was designed to last for about 50 years. Our roadbed actually, some of it has lasted 75 years, but about a decade or more ago, we started a process called total reconstruction, where we're completely excavating and digging up and removing the old turnpike and replacing it with an all-new roadway from the ground up that's wider, 6 lanes instead of 4, with a wider median. Our median today averages about 26 foot wide compared to the old 10 foot of the original highway. And believe it or not, Dennis, widening our turnpike out is one of our biggest priorities. We've built more than 100 miles of new turnpike that would be unrecognizable to the folks who designed and built the original highway 75 years ago. And amazingly, today what we pay is about $25 million per mile to rebuild and widen the turnpike, compared to $70 million to build the entire original 160 miles. So, the price is a lot. The price tag's much higher today. It takes us actually longer, or as long, to build new parts of our roadway than it did the original section of the turnpike. So, in many senses, we've come a long way, but I don't think you could ever today even imagine building 160 miles of highway in less than 2 years. It's never going to happen.
Carl, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd like to go back the day before the turnpike opened and kneel down on the roadway and look at that virgin concrete. No oil marks on it, no tread wear, this beautiful, pristine highway, and look at that and think, boy, we're really starting something big here. I hate to sound as if I work for you, but I've always had this wonderful spot in my heart for the turnpike.
And many people do. There's something alluring about it. It holds a spot in our heart. We have the folks that have had personal experiences like you. We feel dearly about this. Those of us who grew up and were born and raised in Pennsylvania, I think it's really one of the most recognizable assets that we have in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. As a matter of fact, we were having this discussion this morning. If you're from Pennsylvania and you live in Phoenix, or you live in Wyoming, or wherever you live in the Midwest or the West, if you say to people, what do you think of when I say Pennsylvania? The turnpike is probably on a lot of people's top 5 lists. It might be the second or third thing that comes out of your mouth when I say, think of something from Pennsylvania. So it's a great asset. It's wonderful that it's been around for 75 years. It's changed a lot in those 75 years. I think it's gotten better. And we're looking forward to the next 75 years of operations. I'll be long retired, by the way, for the next 75th anniversary.
Carl DeFebo, you've got a fun job there as spokesman for the grandfather of American highways, kind of the East Coast version of Route 66, if you will. And I'll tell you what, being as you're in the 75th year, what a great time to work there.
It is. It's something special to be here. We're looking forward to celebrating this historic and momentous event, and it is. It's a special time to be here. It really is a special time to be an employee at the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and like I said, we're looking forward to serving well beyond 150 years plus. And I think part of that too, Dennis, is that Americans, we do have a love affair with our automobiles, and you can't love your automobile unless you have great places to drive on, and that's what the PA Turnpike provides.
Carl DeFebo, thanks for joining us from your office there in Harrisburg, and happy birthday to the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dennis. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this interview from my new American Montage series. Check out YouTube for more. I'm Dennis Daly.